Hello, everyone. I am Sarah Hubbard, Grant Training Coordinator for the National Children's Advocacy Center and the host of today's webinar. Thank you for joining today's presentation entitled Child Protective Services and Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children, presented by Tanisha Knighton. Tanisha holds a BA, MCJ, and a PhD in clinical psychology. Dr. Knighton is an independent consultant and trainer with over 17 years of combined experience as a social worker with the Cuyahoga County Department of Children and Family Service and the Missing Persons Unit for the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Department. Dr. Knighton creates curricula and provides training on a variety of topics, which include enhancing group therapy strategies, working with sexual offenders, treating juvenile sexual offenders, working with victims of sexual abuse, sexting, teen sexuality, trauma and trauma bonds, missing persons, and human trafficking for a variety of agencies and national conferences. We are delighted to have Tanisha. We are going to turn this presentation over to Tanisha.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you all hear me? I've got a little static feedback on the line.
I can hear you. David, can you hear us?
Okay. All right.
Let me move. What is that? Okay. All right, I moved myself to a presenter to see if that helped out. Do you hear the static anymore?
No, not right now.
Okay. All right.
But I've got feedback on my end.
Okay, what you can do is turn your
we'll try it and
speakers
see
down.
what happens.
Yeah, if you turn your speakers down or your speakers off, that should work on your computer.
Okay. Okay, so sorry about that. Hello, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about CPS and the CSEC response to multidisciplinary team members and safety planning. As Sarah said, my name is Dr. Tanisha Knighton, and I'll be the one running the show for us here today. So hopefully over the next roughly 45 minutes to an hour, we'll cover the following objectives. We hope that you'll understand what effective interagency collaboration is and what it looks like, some of the benefits to that. We'll also learn about the safety plan process when servicing human trafficking victims, and we'll talk about creating a safety plan that uses community resources in terms of overseeing the objectives on the safety plan. Just some basic assumptions that we're making during our conversation today. First is that when we say CSEC, you understand we're talking about commercial sexual exploitation of children. I understand that across the nation, everybody uses different terms. Some are using domestic minor sex trafficking. Some just say human trafficking. Some say sex trafficking. Whichever word is familiar to you when I say CSEC, plug it in right there because they're kind of, for this conversation, especially those words are all going to be interchangeable. At the end of the day, no matter what you call it, our goal, though, is that we're going to work as an NDT in order to best service families and children that are affected. So before we even begin, if you're just tuning in, I want to apologize because we've got folks from all over joining us today. And inevitably somebody in the group is going to feel like, you know what, I already know this material. This is like so elementary. I already know it. Or somebody is going to be like, I don't know what she's talking about. She lost me. So we hope that if we're saying something that you already know, Just wait for it, and hopefully you'll get something out of it that you didn't know. And if you aren't sure what's going on and you need to ask questions, then feel free to ask questions as we go along. When we talk about what is CPS, throughout the country, everybody calls CPS something else. I'm from the great state of Ohio, hey, but here we call it Department of Children and Family Services. In your area, it might be Department of Health and Human Services, it might be Children's Service Board, might be Child Welfare, but for our conversation again today, we're going to use CPS as the term, so that if you call it something else, you know we're all talking about the same thing. So we talk about this concept of human trafficking. The first thing we kind of have to get on the same page about is, what does the federal law say about human trafficking? So the federal law says that if you have the recruiting, harboring, moving, or obtaining a person by force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of involuntary servitude, debt bondage, slavery, or the sex trade, you have human trafficking. Federal law also says that if the child is under the age of 17, you do not have to prove the force, fraud, or coercion piece. And what this looks like in action is the federal law is called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or TVPA. Oh, sorry, my graphic is a little behind. That's just showing you that if you have a kid under the age of 17, the force, fraud, or coercion piece doesn't have to be in place to prove it. So when we look at what is CPS's natural response to a call that comes into their agency, and this may vary just depending on where you're at, but typically when a call comes in, it's either screened in or it's screened out. If it's screened out, that means whatever the call was for, there was not enough information to establish abuse or neglect. So for example, if someone calls in and they don't have enough information about what's going on, that may be a screen out. Or if they call in and they're looking for resources for food or something, that may not necessarily be a screen in, that may be a screen out. Or if it's just random, just information and not a concern about abuse or neglect, all of those would be examples of screen outs. And in those cases, there's nothing else that happens. The information is documented in the CPS system, and depending on the call, CPS may determine, what, this isn't something that meets our screening guideline. However, something that maybe we need to refer to a community resource or to local law enforcement. If the call's information warrants a screen in, then basically there is some sort of allegation of abuse or neglect that has been made, and CPS has to either investigate it because it's a new case, so they're going to determine whether or not the abuse or neglect is indicated or substantiated, or whether the allegation of abuse or neglect is not substantiated at all, or they may determine it's already an open case and this is just more information on an open case. So once the call is screened in, it goes through this initial investigation period, and then if it's unsubstantiated, then the case may be closed. It may be referred to a community provider again. And if it's open, then ideally the family would work with CPS in order to resolve whatever immediate problem was there that was arise. And eventually the goal would be case closure. At the heart of all of CPS's interactions is this concept that the work that they do with each individual family is specific to the family. So there's not this one size fits all kind of plan for the family, but this concept of family-centered practice. And by that, it means we're going to look at what's going on currently with the family, and we're going to go with a strengths-based approach to working with them to resolve whatever the current situation is. Ideally, we want this long-term improvement so that once we resolve the issue today, then hopefully we won't have to have any further interactions with the family. If it can work that way. Sometimes we have to do immediate problem resolution and then work towards this long-term improvement. But sometimes we can start right off the bat with the goal that long-term we shouldn't have any more interactions with the family. But ideally, whatever assessments we're doing with the family, whatever case plan is set up with the family, it's geared towards the family, and the services are individual and not just this kind of cookie cutter. We get a call about a kid not going to school, and you get 15 services, and they're the same 15 services, whether it's educational neglect referral or sex abuse referral. Family centered practice says, no, we don't do business like that. Family centered practice says you got to look at the individual circumstances, and you have to determine what services the family needs and gear those services specifically to the family and what's going on with them. The other piece of family centered practice is to think about permanency or reunification in that long term concept. So, if the situation warrants a removal of the kid, then the plan would be that we're looking for the kid to be reunified, but at the same time, if that can't occur, we're making a plan up front for the long term best interests of the family, for the child, rather. So, in this continuum, our conversation today is about CPS and about CSEC. So when we think about what combination or how do those two interact, what we know is that according to National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, in 2014, 1 in 6 endangered missing kids were reported to National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were likely victims of child sex trafficking. Of those, 68% were in the care of child welfare when they went missing. Um, and so, what that says to us is that we have to really be thinking about when our kids are in custody of a CPS agency and they run away, the likelihood that they may be involved with human trafficking is there. So, prevention piece is a whole nother webinar. But once we realize this is going on, how are we handling that, or what are we doing to deal with it? One of the things that we've seen is that most of our victims aren't jumping up saying, hey, I'm a victim of trafficking, help me. The reality is that once a kid goes missing, as we're making efforts to locate them, that's when we realize that there may be some human trafficking going on. Or in other cases, they're coming into our systems because they're involved with delinquency, unruly, that they've got substance abuse problems, they've got severe mental health problems, and that's when we're seeing them. So when we talk about this connection between CPS and CSEC, we have to understand what are missing kids cases about, because that's kind of where it starts at. So the first type of missing kids case is the ones we're most familiar with, which are those runaway and throwaway kids. And those are kids where the kid is like, you know what, I'm sick of being here, deuces, or the relative is like, you know what, I'm sick of your behavior, get out, right? The second group is family abduction, and in that group is where we have a parent or a relative who is taking the child, and they feel they can do a better job than the custodial parent, so they haven't returned the kid to the person who has actual custody. The third group is not family abductions, and in that group we have folks that are not related to the victim, but they've taken the child. And I'm from Ohio, Cleveland area, so if you know anything about national news, we had a case just like that with Ariel Castro, and unfortunately, at that time when he took his victims, they were Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight. They weren't related, but they had they lived in the same area. His daughter played with them, and that's kind of a common trend when we look at what the research says on non-family abductions, is that sexual abuse is involved, physical abuse is involved, and most times they are taken by someone who had a legitimate reason for being in the same area where they were taken from. And then the fourth group of missing children's cases is that lost or injured. And in the lost category, that's where we would find autistic spectrum kids, kids with developmental delays, and the injured would be when a serious injury has occurred and they physically can't crawl or get to somewhere to say, hey, I need to get home and I can't. So we think about, hey, what is this effective interagency collaboration? You said it, I don't exactly think I know what that means. What's this concept that we need to work as an MDT? So it's when we're talking about working with a kid or a family when it relates to human trafficking, it's not just law enforcement working with the family. It means that we got all of these different organizations, providers, people that these kids might come into contact working together to deal with this particular situation. And it's important because, you know, I'm not picking one profession over another. But sometimes law enforcement feels they know it all. Sometimes CPS feel they know it all. Sometimes, the prosecutor's office, they know it all. Well, the interesting thing is when you look at all these different pieces and parts, the different professions, individually, you can only get so much information. But if you look at the piece that law enforcement brings, the piece that CPS brings, the piece that the medical provider might bring, the piece that the victim advocate might have, the piece that the school might have, the piece that the mental health provider might have, the piece that the foster parent might have, now you've got a more complete picture of all the dynamics going on and possibly over a longer period of time because the therapist might have only been involved for a month whereas the CPS worker has been involved for 4 or 5 years. So it's about getting a total picture of what's going on with the family by tapping into all of the different pieces and parts that can be involved. And if you notice on the display on the screen, there are 4 blank spaces, and that's for you to account for the different providers or services that you might have in your area. For example, in some areas, they have a huge rape crisis center that might be providing extra support with victim advocates or with counseling or with support groups. So you would fill in the circle with whichever other resources in your area that aren't already accounted for. The beauty is that, again, they bring all these different skills, these different perspectives to the team, and it allows for a greater approach at dealing with problem resolution. So instead of just having one mindset trying to deal with the problem, now we have the potential for 8 or 9 different people in different disciplines being able to work together to resolve the current situation. And each member of the team has a valuable role. So when we think about, well, we're going to do a safety plan for the family, when you have that multidisciplinary team in place, it's not just the family and the worker that the plan falls back on. Maybe now you can engage your faith based organization to help with supervision. Maybe you can engage the therapist as another point of contact with the family in order to ensure that at the end of the day, the kids are safe. So I've already kind of gone over this, but the one thing I will add about CPS's natural role in the multidisciplinary process is number one, in most areas, the CPS worker is the one who's going to have the access to services, and CPS usually is the connection between the court because if any agency has to petition for custody, it's going to be CPS. And then the third is that in most areas across the country, CPS is the one who has the team meetings to sit down and kind of review the progress of the case and what's going on currently with the family members. So for me, CPS, and I may be a little biased because I come from a CPS background, but CPS is your most important piece of that puzzle. And it's not saying that the other disciplines aren't important. I'm just saying that based on trends across the country, CPS is kind of like the ringleader and they get everybody to the table and open up the discussion and kind of steer the ship throughout the life of the case. When we think about how does child welfare respond to this concept of CSEC, what we are seeing right now is that 26 states have a limit to the cases that CPS can respond to when it comes to CSEC. In that, if the abuser, the pimp, or the John in the case is a custodian or they're living in the home, then CPS will respond. Only 6 states throughout the country have explicit CSEC mandates, like they would abuse and neglect mandates. And the remaining states have the presumption that it's either captured under abuse or neglect. So if the parent knew that the kid was involved with some sort of CSEC activity, then that would be neglect because they failed to protect them. And if it's a stranger stranger who's the pimp, then that would be considered stranger danger under abuse. So it's interesting as things change and as people become more aware of this problem, we anticipate that this may change um, in the future, and that's some of the suggestions that came out of the recommendations for best practices that each state should have specific CSEC mandates in their state law. So where are you at for your state when you think about how do we respond? Where's your state at? And here it is. It's called the 10 emerging promising practices with CPS and child sex trafficking. The first is institute mandatory screening. So that means anytime a case comes in, are you screening to determine whether or not the child may be involved with um, with human trafficking? So whether they're coming in for an unruly or they're coming in for um, educational neglect, is there some sort of screening process? If a kid goes AWOL, are you screening to see what their activities might be involved in? Number two, the suggestion is that you should have specialized advocates in your child welfare centers. So, unlike most situations where there's a child advocacy center and there's an advocate associated with the child advocacy center or the local rape crisis center, do you have advocates right in child welfare? So, that means that if a worker who has not had the opportunity to have a one on one contact or interview with a victim of human trafficking, they can access the advocate and the advocate could walk them through that interview process, that assessment process. Or the advocate would be able to do special training for workers who haven't had direct contact with victims of trafficking. Or the advocate would be able to go out and assist in the middle of the night when an emergency occurs with a kid who might be on the caseload or a new case coming into the agency. The third suggestion is that you got to coordinate between juvenile court and your county courts. In that, safe harbor is a caveat to the law for kids who are under who for delinquent kids whose criminal actions are a direct result of being trafficked. If they are put into safe harbor, then they work basically like a diversion program, if you will, um, in order to have the criminal charges be nullified if they successfully complete. So, are you collaborating with your juvenile justice systems? Because is there any kind of cross training going on so that jurists, bailiffs, CASAs, GALs, they are all aware, prosecuting attorneys, they're all aware of what trafficking looks like and whether or not some of the things that they're seeing with kids that are coming into their systems are actually delinquent behaviors, or is this delinquency a result of possible trafficking activity? Another thing you got to do is you simply got to train your workers. And I take this to mean that not train about trafficking from a facts and figures perspective, but train about trafficking as a culture. And within that culture, there are certain things that are inherent within that culture. If you can understand the culture, then you have a better opportunity of understanding what you're seeing when you see a kid in a different situation. So, is there training being provided to the workers so that they really understand what trafficking entails and what that looks like, and having information that they can go back and apply to their current work situation? For example, understanding the language, understanding trauma and the impact that trauma has on a victim, understanding trauma bond connection, things of that nature. Additionally, CPS should participate in a broad coalition. So, do you have a local coalition in human trafficking in your area? And is CPS a part of that? Because that brings about a ton of resources. For example, the opportunity to understand what types of treatment are available in your community for potential victims of trafficking, to understand if there are any support groups in the area, to understand what housing options are out there. You got to participate and understand what's going on so that when you're presented with a case, you know how to effectively respond. And then there's this idea that there should be a centralized listing of victim services. So basically, whether that's a printed copy that you can hand someone or something that's accessed on the internet, but it should basically list out what services are in the community and who do you call? Because if you have um, a victim of trafficking who's recovered at 2, 3 in the morning and you need some place for them to go for the night, what's the plan? Do you have resources for that? Is it listed so that whether it's a hotline worker or the assigned worker working that case, they know where those resources are as well? And then there's this concept that you got to coordinate between local hospitals and children's advocacy centers. So if kids are coming in to see a same nurse for STD or pregnancy test, are they doing some sort of screening? And then what are they doing if they are screening with that information? Are they reporting it back to their local CPS or not? And then you also got to coordinate with your local rape, crisis, and sexual assault centers, which I've already said. They have a number of resources um, available that may not be available anywhere else. So, do you have some sort of contact with them? If you think about what trafficking is, there are a lot of things that go into it, but at the end of the day, our victims are exposed to forced sexual interactions. So, if, for example, a girl has $1,000 quota a day, and in order to meet that quota, she's sleeping with, between 10 or 15 um, johns per night. That can equate to anywhere between 1,500 and almost 4,000 forced sexual interactions for the year. And if she's sleeping with upwards to 20, 25 men a night, then that could be close to 8,000 forced sexual interactions in 1 year's time. So the people that are geared to deal with that, to really understand and be able to deal with that trauma, are your local rape crisis centers. Do you have a relationship with them? Are they a part of your team? Are they providing insight and services to help navigate these systems with our victims? And then another practice is we got to have some sort of central data collection or some sort of way of tracking these cases. That could be as simple as in your CPS database marking the cases to say that there's human trafficking involved, but there needs to be some way to identify that there's potential for that there's previous human trafficking involvement on a case, so that as a new worker coming in, they're aware of that right off the front. And then the last one, which I already said, is that the state needs to provide guidelines. So right now, like I said, there are only 6 states that have an actual CSEC mandate in their state guidelines. And some of them, if it's not in the family home, then they don't even respond. So we really have to work on changing that perception, because yes, it is possible to have a pimp that's a mother, an older sibling, a grandfather, a spouse in the home, but there's also a potential for them not to be there. And that doesn't mean that that child doesn't deserve our services. It means we need to change our law so that we can make sure that we're ensuring that all kids are safe. Ideally, no matter where you are across the country, you're doing some sort of structured decision making. Whether you're doing, a safety assessment, a risk assessment, a family strengths and needs assessment, it should be occurring on every case that comes into CPS. So best practices also is saying that you should be documenting your um, human trafficking assessment right into the safety assessment or right into your risk assessment. In the safety assessment for our state, we have a category called others, the last little box on the safety assessment. So right there, you should be putting it in. In some states, I've heard they're putting it in under their sex abuse safety objective. Wherever it is, it should be on one of those assessments. And the thought processing is, if you document it in the case notes, that's wonderful. It's great that it's there. But the likelihood that if a new worker or an intake worker who's handling an emergency is going to have the opportunity to go back and read through each and every set of notes is not as likely as it would be for them to review a safety assessment or the past risk assessment to determine what information is there for the family. So that's why it needs to be documented there. So when we think about this whole safety planning concept, the idea is that we're assessing safety at this moment. And what that means is that we're looking at whether or not whatever is going on threatens the immediate harm of the child and whether or not a safety plan is needed to keep that kid safe right now. And then we talk about risk. Risk is looking at the level of future maltreatment. So whether or not something is likely to happen in the future. So we have to make sure you understand safety and risk. Ideally, they should go hand in hand. But for most intensive purposes, if there is a safety issue that's going on right now, what do we need to do today to now to ensure this kid is safe? And then the risk is talking about what do we need to do to ensure in the future that this kid is safe, right? So what do? We create a safety plan in most places. And a safety plan is a specific and concrete strategy for controlling threats of serious harm to a child or children. So, like, what does that mean? Well, if you think about it, effective safety plans, they are implemented immediately. Like, I don't know how else to say that. Immediately. It's not you get a call at 4:30 and you got tickets to a sporting event, so you wait until Monday to deal with it. No, a safety plan means at 5 o'clock when you figure out this is what it is, here's the safety plan to deal with it, right? Ideally, the safety plan is to keep the kids safe. That's the plan. That's the point of it, is to keep the kids safe. And it needs some sort of participation and agreement from everybody who's listed on the safety plan. Because the safety plan is no good if everybody doesn't agree, everybody isn't okay with participating, then it's not going to be effective. Additionally, safety plans should be short term and they should be reviewed because safety planning, it's a process. It's not, here's a safety plan done. Because what happens if this great safety plan on paper and in reality, it's not as good as we thought it was going to be? You have to review it. You have to determine whether or not it's a good safety plan or whether or not things need to be reworked, revised, or whatever, because we're still addressing the safety threat that's going on right now. And then last but certainly not least, you really should try to involve relatives, non-relatives, community resources, anybody who is a support to the family. If you can, you want to have them involved in the safety plan. Just some things about insight and safety. If you didn't know, they are not the same thing. They just, you hope that the family has some insight into their problem and you hope that the kid is safe, but they aren't the same thing and they sometimes don't go hand in hand. What we do know is that the best predictor of future maltreatment is past maltreatment, and the best predictor of future acts of protection is past acts of protection. So if they have kept kids safe in the past, then they'll probably keep them safe in the future. If they haven't been able to keep the kids safe and something has happened, then more than likely that pattern is going to continue again. So if there's a danger, what is the family and the MDT willing and able to do about it? That should be the question that you ask anytime that you write a safety plan or anytime you feel a safety plan is warranted. What is the family and the MDT willing and able to do about this danger that currently exists? So the three types of safety plans we're going to review real quick. One is the in-home safety plan, second is out-of-home safety plan, and the third is the legally authorized out-of-home safety plan. So the in-home safety plan says the kid stays in the home and we're going to put supports in place to ensure the kid is safe. Out-of-home safety plan says, hey, we would love for this kid to stay at home, but right now that's not the safest place for the kid to be. So mom and dad still maintain custody, but we're going to put this kid in a different place to make sure they're safe. And then legally authorized out-of-home safety plan is basically it's been determined that no one is there to keep this kid safe. So CPS needs to maintain custody or obtain custody of the kid. So when we think about what is the safe situation, that means there are no current safety threats. There's sufficient protective capacities by the parent, and intervention is not necessary at this time. So if a kid accidentally falls and breaks a leg, it's an accident. There isn't anything that currently would warrant a safety plan just based on the information given. Now, once the worker goes out and investigates, that might be something different. But based on the information given, right now there's no active safety threat. It was an accident. It was a one-time thing. There's no issues. The previous broken legs. Parents took the kid, directly to the emergency room, so they've got sufficient protective factors. And right now, there's no intervention that's necessary. What you want to think about is that if there becomes a situation where something is going on and you need to up the ante and think about writing a safety plan, consider, will adding a sober caretaker um, change the situation? Would giving the family access to a food pantry, would that change the situation? Would having the family be involved with a community provider for the weekend, would that change the situation? Would having the faith-based organization participate in the safety plan change the situation? And if those things are possible as interventions, then an in-home safety plan becomes possible for the family. So when we look at an in-home safety plan, the kid remains in the home. There has to be some sort of active safety threat to the kid going on. The parents have to agree with what's going on, and ideally you want it to be least restrictive, so they're staying in their own home, and maybe we're having somebody come into the home. And then hopefully there's some sort of supplemental protective factors that are available for the family to help through this time. There's no change in custody, and intervention is necessary, otherwise you wouldn't have a safety plan, right? So ideally in your head, you're asking, can I remove the threat? If you say yes, then it's an in-home safety plan. If you say no, then your next question should be, well, can I control it? And if the answer is yes, we can, then we can go with the in-home. If the answer is no, we can't control this, then we need to look at a possible out-of-home safety plan. So here's a case example. In this particular situation, Bridget and Eric are mom and dad, and they have an 8-year-old child, Layla. Bridget's biological father, Thomas, is in the home with them, and Thomas just recently moved into the home, and the reason he moved in is because he has some disabilities, and he is now on disability, Social Security disability, and he's residing with his daughter, granddaughter, and his son-in-law. Well, Thomas decided that, the money that he's getting per month is not quite enough. So he's going to supplement his disability by having Layla go out to truck stops and do different things at the truck stops in order for him to get income to supplement his disability. Layla discloses this, and Bridget feels like, this is my dad. He's in a bad place. This is, an isolated situation. I don't want my dad to be out of the home. Well, Bridget's got a number of supports. Her mom and stepdad are around. Her sister and her sister's mom are around. So the question in this situation is, is Layla safe? If she's not, how can we keep her safe? So in this particular situation, this is the first disclosure. There was some concern about whether or not the information that Layla provided could be proved. So I know some people are like, oh my goodness, immediately we got to remove Thomas out the home. There's no way this kid can be safe. But at the this second, we don't know enough information about what has happened, when it's happened, and things of that nature. So our concern is, yes, we need to keep Layla safe, but how do we do that? In this particular instance, we have a second parent in the home, and we have a number of relatives who are near and dear to the family, as well as some clergy folk who the family is involved with. So in this particular situation, the plan, while investigation was underway, was to ensure that Layla was not left with Thomas. So Thomas wasn't providing any kind of care for Layla while the parents ran out or anything. And Bridget and Eric agreed that they wouldn't allow Thomas to supervise their child, and they allowed their sister, Bridget's sister Lynette, to come into the home and provide supervision, as well as Bridget's parents to come in, so that there's always two adults in the home overseeing the care of Layla, and also just kind of being an in between in case somebody had to go to the bathroom or something. There's always a second person involved. And in that case, Layla was able to remain in the home, but the safety threat was able to be controlled because you got these other people able to offer supervision and to oversee what was going on in the home. When we think about what is the out-of-home safety plan, or what warrants an out-of-home safety plan, well, first and foremost, the kid is out of the home because some sort of intervention was necessary because there's an active safety threat. The thing about this is the custody of the child doesn't change. Parents still have custody, so they have to agree with the safety plan. They have to sign off on it. But what we're doing is we're adding somebody else that's specifically responsible for the care of the kid since they're not in the parent's home. And unfortunately, the protective factors that the parents have, they can't supplement, or we're not able to supplement those protective capacities. So ideally, there's nothing we could do right now to help them to kind of deal with what's going on. So in this case, your question becomes like, how do I know this is out of home versus we need CPS to take custody? Well, one of the questions you're asking, is there a responsible person to care for the kid? If the answer is yes, well, then we can talk about an out-of-home safety plan. If the answer is no, then we need to be talking about CPS taking custody or a legally authorized safety plan. So in this case example, we have 17-year-old Peyton, who is actively involved in trafficking. She has a female pimp who is the mother of one of her girlfriends, female friends, school-age friend. And Peyton is actually in her grandparents' home, so Tamala and David's home. But her mom and dad, Chrissy and Matt, are in and out of Tamala and David's home very, very frequently. And what they've noticed is that anytime Peyton has any interactions with her dad, Matt, then she runs away and is gone for extended periods of time. The parents have some substance abuse history that's long history of substance abuse. But we also have Renee, which is the variable here that was the changing for this particular situation, in that Renee said that, her belief is that the reason that Peyton runs away is because the dad previously sexually abused them. She's adult at this time, but she admits dad previously sexually abused her, and that the grandparents minimize everything that the dad does. And, grandma's like, well, you're not pure yourself. You got your flaws, and that's my son, and I'm not going to stop my son from coming to my home. Well, in this situation, this was different than the previous case where we have information that Matt and Chrissy are currently using drugs. The grandparents are refusing to put any limits about the contact that they're having with their kid. And we have a pattern that every time Peyton sees her parents, then she runs away and she has even more trouble. So her behaviors tend to escalate. In this particular case, we would look at probably an out-of-home safety plan because we don't have any other family members right now that are able to provide care for Peyton. Grandparents aren't keeping her safe because they're allowing these things to continue to go on in their home. So this is the case where we would look at an out-of-home, a legally authorized out-of-home safety plan. So ideally, there's a situation where you have these active safety threats. The kid is out of home, and custody changes. So now CPS has custody and not the parents. But the resources and the protective capacities that the family has is just not sufficient enough to ensure that the kid is safe. And we also want to make sure that when we're looking at legally authorized out-of-home safety plans that we're looking at most restrictive. So a foster home versus a group home or something of that nature. But when we talk about this caregiver's capacity or willingness to protect, we have to, kind of put those words into perspective. Cannot means that there's a situation where they may be delayed or impaired. Will not means they're denying what's going on or they're vacillating, going back and forth about, where they're at. And then has not means they're unwilling to or they failed to protect in the past. So just some things to consider when we're talking about a safety plan, right? I come from that old school mentality where it takes a village to raise a kid. And so therefore it's not just the parents. We want to tap into as many people as we can. When we talk about that Peyton example, she's involved with therapy. She's got a probation officer. The grandparents are faith oriented. So those are all people. If the situation were different and we could put Peyton, leave Peyton in the care of grandma and grandpa, then maybe we could safety plan it. And here are all these community resources that we want to add into the safety plan to ensure she's safe, right? At a certain age, when kids can be involved, you want them to be involved with the safety plan as well. Have them be a part of the discussion, ask them what they want, ask them for suggestions, because maybe there's a local friend whose parent is really responsible and might be a great place for them to go, when they're frustrated. Instead of running away, then maybe this is your go-to place for, 2 or 3 hours so that you can calm down and prevent you from running away. And then think about the fact that safety planning is a journey, it's not a product. So it may change, hopefully it gives the safety plan will give your journey some sort of direction, because your end goal should be safety of the child. And so that safety plan may go in and out, it may go back and forth, it may look completely different after you review it 2 or 3 times than the original safety plan looked. And then you want to ensure that safety plan specifically addresses the behavior that's a danger. So if it's running away, the safety plan needs to address that. If it's drugs, the safety plan needs to address that. And then hopefully you have everyone in agreement that future safety is important, right? Like, it's not just about today, right now, they're safe because it's 5 o'clock and the worker's out the home, but in the next, 34, 46, 72 hours, the kid is safe as well. And you have to think relationships are important. And at some point in time, CPS isn't going to be involved with the family. So if you can establish those relationships now, then in the end, they continue to thrive because they have that connection and that support that they need in order to be successful. And with that, I thank you for joining in with me. Here's my contact information. Feel free to shoot me a call, shoot me an email if you have questions or concerns, anything I can try to answer for you. And we'll turn